Evening, everybody. I can't believe there was two novels referenced during open mic. That's pretty impressive. I felt like I was in English lit class. So there we go. Don't touch anything else. I always enjoy coming here to UCM, and thanks for having me and letting me be part of your community this evening. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Todd, and I work on campus as a chaplain, as a student pastor. I work with students and with faculty. And I've lived here in Kelowna since the end of 2016, after some professional stops as a pastor and as a professor in Europe and in Africa. And I live here in Kelowna with my wife, and we have 3 kids. Our kids are between the ages of 10 and 15, which means that we have to have Disney Plus at home. There's no question about it. It's inevitable. I guess people older than 15 have Disney Plus too. Right on. So on Disney Plus right now, there's this great documentary about the Beatles called Get Back. Just bring up the slide. Have any of you seen this? Some of you. I really recommend it. It recounts in detail the making of the Beatles' iconic 1970 album, Let It Be. And it follows the kind of creative process by which the 4 Beatles write and record songs for the album. Sometimes they're fighting with each other. Sometimes they're the best of friends. Sometimes they're the worst of enemies. And it's just fascinating to see a classic rock song like Get Back actually come together in real time. And what I found really remarkable was what happens to the Beatles when they get a creative block, like when they're working on a song and it fails. They just can't move it forward. They take a break, they smoke cigarettes, and the whole documentary is under this cloud of smoke, like I was coughing just watching it. But then what I find really interesting is that they move themselves out of this creative block by going into their back catalog. So one of the Beatles, usually Paul McCartney, will start to play an old Beatles hit from the beginning of their career, like I Want to Hold Your Hand, or She Loves Me, and the others will join in. Or sometimes it'll be a folk song, an old folk song, or old Chuck Berry, or Carl Perkins. Something classic, something really old. And then the whole group comes together and they begin to jam the song. And then slowly but surely, the song morphs, it changes into the new song that they were trying to work on. It's just remarkable to see. And what I learned from watching this was when we're in a rut, get back to older sources. We can find rejuvenation by going into our back catalog. I think this is true of creative thinking, and I think it's also true of Christian thinking. When we're stuck, we can go into our back catalog for inspiration. And that's what I heard Pastor James doing last week by introducing you to these strange women and men in the church's past, in our back catalog as Christians. These are monks and nuns who, if you remember, they left the comfort of home, of family, and they sought to live alone or with each other in community, sometimes out in the desert. And there they wanted to commit themselves to a life of kind of radical commitment to Jesus Christ. They wanted to grow closer to Jesus through solitude and simplicity and spiritual discipline. And these people are strange, right? There's no doubt about it. How many of you were here last week and saw the talk? Yeah, most of you. These are weird people, right? Like Grace, you can show the picture. St. Anthony, he's fighting demons in the desert. Here he is getting clobbered. They're tempting him. Or James told us about Simeon, the stalactite who lives on top of a pillar. Crazy stuff. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, what in heaven's name could I learn from these guys, these women? They're strange. But when we strip away some of their eccentric behavior, like Pastor James said, we hear a call to protest what's wrong with the world, a world that God made and that he loves. And we hear a call to deny ourselves, maybe those very things that are holding us back from a deeper commitment to Jesus Christ. So the sheer strangeness of Antony and other monks and nuns might help us see our own lives more clearly and hear God's call on our life more surely. So I want to go to our back catalog again. Like the Beatles did, get back, this time to the 17th century and Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. How many of you have heard of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha? Someone's, you're maybe, no one else? Perfect. Good, well then I can introduce you to her because she's very interesting. And I think she can help us break out of a rut. I think we're stuck. And I think she can help us break out of that to a deeper commitment to Jesus Christ. And she does this in a very particular and challenging way, as I think you'll see. So let me take 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to tell you her story, and then we'll unpack it with an eye on what it has to say to us today in our moment, okay? So the story begins in the 1600s in the Great Lakes region of North America. Thanks, Grace. And the dominant power at that time is First Nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or we often call them the 5 nations of the Iroquois. Today there's 6 nations, back then there was 5. And Tekakwitha was born among the Mohawk tribe of the Iroquois Confederacy of the nations in the year 1656. At the age of 4, a smallpox epidemic ravages her village. It kills her mother, many others, also kills her father, who's a chief. And Tekakwitha herself is badly scarred by the pox, and she would struggle the rest of her life with poor eyesight and poor health. Now, at this time, there was an encroaching European presence in the area. Fur traders, some settlers, soldiers, and there was occasionally tension between these powers. And in 1666, the French sent a battalion down from Quebec, south, and attacked her village. And Tekakwitha and her family and her people had to flee. And they fled across the Mohawk River and settled there. And there were interesting French missionaries already active in the area. These were Roman Catholic missionaries who belonged to an order called the Jesuits. Famous in Canadian history, Robe Noire, the black robes. And Tekakwitha was fascinated by these black robes, by these Christian priests, by their preaching about Jesus. And interestingly, in this new place where she and her people settled, there were already a number of Wendat and Algonquin women who had pledged to become celibate. In other words, they refused to be married off and were abstaining from sex. And Tekakwitha was fascinated by their lifestyle. She herself actually refused a couple offers of marriage. So intrigued she was by this lifestyle, this witness. And she became friends with the Jesuit father, Jacques de Lamaville, who was the head of the mission, and she began to study scripture and the Christian faith under him. She was also deeply impressed by the black robes, the Jesuits' witness to peace and reconciliation. At that time, a band of Mohicans from the south came up and attacked her village. And the Mohawks fought them off, and they captured 40 warriors. And over 3 days, they slowly tortured them to kill them on the 3rd day. And the black robes were interceding the whole time, asking them to forgive the Mohicans, urging peace. She was deeply impressed by this. In 1676, she took the plunge, literally. She was baptized. She decided to become a Christian. And she took the name Catherine, from one of the great saints of the medieval church, or in her language, Kateri, hence Kateri Tekakwitha. And being baptized was no small thing. It was, in many ways, a decisive break with her people. She became subject to persecution by them. It drew their wrath, especially because she still refused to get married. And there were, in fact, multiple accusations of infidelity directed her way. There was a kind of smear campaign against her, and it got so bad that at the urging of Father Lamberville, he suggested to her that she flee the village. So she fled north to what is nowadays Montreal. And she settled there with some other new Christian Mohawks and joined a larger group of Iroquois converts. And there she spent her days cultivating a very deep devotional life. She prayed a lot, she fasted, she tried to take the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, every day if she could. At the same time, she was living true to her people. She would go on the regular winter hunts with the Iroquois. And she did that right up until her death. At some point, she decided to take a vow of perpetual celibacy. Sounds heavy, doesn't it? Perpetual celibacy, to never marry, but to devote herself to Jesus Christ and to the church. And she dreamed, actually, of creating an indigenous order of nuns. But then in 1680, at the age of 24, she died. Kateri Tekakwitha is deeply beloved by First Nation Christians in Canada and in the northern United States, especially by Roman Catholics. She's remembered as the Lily of the Mohawks. You can bring up the next slide. The Lily of the Mohawks because of the purity of her heart and her life. And in 2012, she was canonized by Pope Benedict, which means she was officially made a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. She is the very first North American Aboriginal saint. Certainly will not be the last. Okay, so there was our history lesson. Deep into the back catalog of the church. What strikes you as unusual, or at least surprising, about this story of Saint Kateri? Anything jump out at you? Yeah.
She was reading scripture. Like, I don't know, were they able to speak English? Were they able to read English?
It was already, good question. It was already being translated.
What was translated?
It was being translated into her language. She was not reading it. She was having it read to her. Yeah. Yeah. Abstaining from marriage and going so far as to become celibate herself. Really strange, isn't it? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Anything else strike you as surprising? Yeah. Yeah, really young death. Although sadly, maybe not as surprising then. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, good point. His remarkable serenity in her heart and purity for someone who'd gone through so much tragedy and suffering. Yeah.
That she was accepting of the French missionaries, even though it was the French that destroyed the village.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. This is something that I think strikes me. She's First Nations and becomes a Christian. And the narrative right now with the tragedy of our residential schools is often to play Indigenous and Christian against each other. But that's just one terrible chapter of a long story. And here we have another example, a different kind of example of someone of their own free will choosing to become Christian. And in fact, there were a lot of First Nation Christians at this time. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, it was. Yeah. She didn't she felt like she had to leave some things behind, but certainly not everything. She's a strong woman, a very strong woman. I think we also should just recognize that. Sometimes we act, or you hear things like Christianity disempowers women. You might hear that in your classes, in fact. This is not the case. She lives in a culture where being married meant giving her body and her soul to her husband. It meant giving her womb to her tribe. Her job was to create babies, create warriors. And in both cases, she's saying, no, my body is mine, or really my body is God's, and I have freedom and responsibility over it. This is brave, really brave, very countercultural. And then, as you said, this fascination with celibacy. She chose not to have sexual relations. In her case, she took a radical vow of perpetual celibacy. And in doing so, she joins with many Christians over the centuries, especially women, who choose a life of celibacy. There's always cost involved. Some of them are Catholic, some of them are Orthodox, and some of them are Protestant. When I was studying theology at university in Montreal, I had two professors, one Catholic and one Protestant, both of whom had chosen a celibate life. What were they thinking? It seems almost unthinkable in our culture right now to deny ourselves sex, right? And for some of you, it might even seem incomprehensible to think of Kateri's life as a good life, a life that was flourishing, that was true, that was happy, because it didn't include sex, because she was single. Over the past couple of decades, really since the 1960s, sexuality has become a kind of identifying marker. We use it to identify ourselves, to build our identity. And the idea that every human, every person needs a kind of sexual experience in order to live authentically has become a dominant narrative. Sex and romance we think of as rights, things we're entitled to, and something we have to have if we're going to be happy. So now there's actually shame attached sometimes to being single. Maybe not at your age, but give yourself a decade. As if your sexual longings go unfulfilled, you've messed up somehow, certainly missed out. And some of you might even be worrying with Valentine's Day coming up on Monday, if you're going to have an emotional hangover during the week, right? Because you don't have that special person in your life. As if the only way to receive love in this world is through romance, boxes of chocolate. Here's my radical suggestion. Let's scratch Valentine's Day off the calendar, okay? Yeah. Yeah, don't distract me. Let's, instead of Valentine's Day, let's celebrate April 17th, Saint Kateri Tekakwitha's commemoration day. Have a feast, invite your friends, raise a glass of wine, and toast Saint Kateri. Come on, she has a lot more in common with you than Saint Valentine does. She's Canadian, right? Many of you are, and if you're not, you're at least studying here in Canada. She's an empowered woman, like many of you are. She's young, like you. And she's celibate, like most of you are too. Right? I'm not being facetious. How do I know most of you aren't having sex? Not because you're religious, but because you're Gen Z. And Gen Z has the least amount of sex of any generation since the 1960s. Congratulations. Or I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. Bring up the next slide, Grace. Now, what I'm saying now is drawing off of some of the latest statistical research in the West, drawing also interestingly on Japan. So this is a Western Japanese study. And it's summarized in The Atlantic. You know the journal The Atlantic? It's kind of a pop intellectual journal. This is a brilliant article. So I gave you the address if you want to follow up things I'm saying here. But we're in the midst of what social scientists are calling the Great Sex Recession. This article begins with this sentence. Bring up the next slide, please, Grace. Polyamory is a household word. Shame-laden terms like perversion have given way to cheerful-sounding ones like kink. Anal sex has gone from final taboo to fifth base. Teen Vogue, yes, Teen Vogue, even ran a guide to it. With the exception of perhaps incest and bestiality, you know what that is, right? Good, I don't want to explain it. Our culture has never been more tolerant of sex in just about every permutation. But despite all this, American teenagers and young adults are having less sex. In the space of a generation, sex has gone from something most high school students have experienced to something most haven't. And no, they aren't having oral sex instead. That rate hasn't changed much. This is a remarkable discrepancy because we talk about sex all the time. It's on all our screens, it's in our music, and we act, culturally, we act as if all of us are always having sex. You know this from campus, right? None of it's true. Fewer and fewer people are actually having sex, and your generation is most abstemious. So the author is asking, how can this be when hookup and dating apps are just a fingertip away, and we allow anything in sex as long as it's consensual? The narrative from the 60s was, as long as we remove taboos and restrictions, we will create a culture that's free, that's flourishing, that's sexually healthy. And the opposite's the case. When even secular writers think there's something sick about our society. What's going on? What kind of a mess are we in? Can St. Kateri and men like her speak into this mess? Can they help us think maybe less culturally, more Christianly? The desert, as Pastor James said last week, can be desolate and demanding. And I know when you're single, you can feel that way, as if you're in a desert. And this thirst for intimacy doesn't get quenched. But what if people from our back catalog, voices from our back catalog, like St. Kateri, could show us how to embrace the desert and even make it a place of flourishing? So that's what I want to do in my closing section here. I want to very quickly sketch out a theology of celibacy and suggest ways it might connect with you guys as students. We don't have time to unfold an entire theology of sex, so don't worry about that. We're not going to go into great detail. Although if you're interested, later in March, I'm going to run a small group on Christian ethics using the Ten Commandments. This is a very venerable way of thinking about the ethical life. And we'll talk definitely about a theology of sex there because that's one of the commandments directly addresses it. So if you're interested, stay tuned. But in a nutshell, I can say this. For Christians, how we view sex, and therefore how we talk about celibacy, it's not first and foremost about feelings or even urges. Sex is actually a response to who God is and what he's done for us as our creator and our redeemer. You could say that sex is a witness to the gospel. And two paths get opened up traditionally for Christians. This is a traditional view. Two paths open up as a faithful response to who God is. And we see both of these responses in Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19. You bring that up, Grace? So in this passage, which I'll just leave up on the screen, Jesus is reaffirming that God has created us man and woman and called us into union together, exclusive union together in marriage. And he says this is irrevocable. And so his disciples actually say, they're like, wow, this is hard. Maybe it's better not to do it. And he's like, yeah, maybe. And then he says the alternative is to be a eunuch. In other words, to be celibate. And at the very end, he says, the one who can accept this should accept it. In other words, this is also hard. So two paths open up before us. They're both difficult and they require self-denial, but they're both joyful witnesses to our Creator and our Savior. So for marriage, when a man and a woman commit to each other in faithful, exclusive love, they are a sign of the faithful, exclusive love that God has for his people. In fact, our relationship with God in the Bible is often compared to a marriage, some of you know. And as this man and woman come together, their difference becomes one through love. And this is a sign, too, of how God, who is different from us, unites himself with us in Jesus Christ, in love. And indeed, this love is fruitful because a man and a woman can create babies. Go figure. Just like God's love brings life. So for Christians, love-making and life-making are very closely and essentially connected. And throughout all this is this sense of marriage and sex as being a radical orientation to the other, to the other's needs. So much so that we see, for example, in St. Paul, you can bring up this next slide, when he's offering advice to early Christians in the Corinthian church, he says, a wife doesn't have authority over her body, but yields it, and he's talking about sex explicitly here, yields it to her husband. Most men in the Roman Empire would have thought, yeah, of course she should. But then he goes on and says, in the same way, the husband doesn't have authority over his body, but he yields it to his wife. Very radical. The very first thought in marriage is about the other. The very first thought in sex is about the other's need. And this too signs the gospel. God loves the other so much that he serves them. He gives himself to them. And that's what we do in marriage. Sex shows this brilliantly. So that's the one way. And the other way that Jesus sets out for us is celibacy, the eunuch way. When we're celibate, we're also responding to God's love as creator, as redeemer. In this case, we do it by refraining from sex. That's a way of reaffirming that sex belongs in marriage. But it's also a sign that as wonderful as sexual intimacy is, it's not the highest good. It's not the only good. Our longing for sex at its deepest, its most powerful level, is a longing to be perfectly loved and wholly accepted. And no human being, not even a spouse, can fulfill that. If you project that need onto your boyfriend or girlfriend, you will obliterate them. If I project that onto my wife, she would crack. That's a longing that's only filled in God. So the Protestant theologian Wesley Hill, who's one of the most interesting writers in the church right now on sex and celibacy, describes the freedom that comes from being celibate like this. It's about giving up one way of expressing love in order to be able to love widely, profligately, indiscriminately. It's about foregoing a spouse in order to love a community. It's about giving up the possibility of children in order to become a spiritual father or mother in the family called church. It's about becoming a little less entangled in the life of the world in order to be a little bit more free, to celebrate the coming kingdom of God, in which none of us will be married and all of us will be spiritual friends with everyone else in the new creation that God will usher in. It's a great description of a celibate life. He lives it himself. He lives with a married couple. He's the godfather, I think, of 5 or 6 kids. He's got a rich, deep community life. And do you hear in this quotation from Hale this same radical orientation to the good of the other? It's not the narrow focus on a spouse that we see in marriage. It's a wider focus on the good of friendships, of other people. That's what St. Kateri and other nuns and monks were seeking. They wanted a way of loving others deeply and widely in a way that would have been impossible if they had been married with children. So both marriage and celibacy are joyful, difficult witnesses to the God who creates us and who has loved us into his own life through Jesus Christ. If you were raised in the church, most of you think that marriage is the default, right? Like it's going to happen to you, whether you like it or not. It might. I want to commend to you this evening celibacy, okay? I want to commend it to you. Now, I don't mean a vow of perpetual celibacy like St. Kateri. Don't do anything that crazy yet. I want you to think about being celibate for a week or a month or a semester. Most of you are involuntarily celibate. You're, what is that, incels? Is that the word? No, incels are the violent ones, not that. Think about being voluntarily celibate, deliberately celibate, as an opportunity to better love Christ and others. This could turn the desert of singleness into a time of flourishing, into an oasis. And really what we know from our culture, as the article from The Atlantic make clear, the alternatives out there aren't very compelling or winsome. Research shows Gen Z, your generation, caught between very occasional casual sex and no sex. Rates of marriage have dropped. Cohabitation has dropped. People aren't even living together anymore. You're literally stuck between a rock and a hard place. No sex or occasional hookups. One social scientist has described young people, especially young men, as procrastinators. Bring up the slide. This is I can't say this word without giggling. A procrastinator. This is combining the word procrastinate and masturbate. As a pastor, I know a lot of procrastinators. Some of them are your age, some of them are older. These are people, as social scientists describe it, who are avoiding intimate relationships, sexual relationships, but also any intimate relationships, because it's safer not to take the risk, to be vulnerable, to love, to give of yourself. So they opt for sex for one, which of course isn't really sex at all. Procrastination reveals this deep loneliness and alienation in our culture. And then on the other hand, the other side of the spectrum is the culture of hooking up. The theologian William Kavanaugh writes this in his book, Being Consumed. What really characterizes consumer culture is not attachment to things, but detachment. People don't cling to things. They discard them, and they buy other things. See, in a consumer culture, everything's a commodity, right? We don't really value them or cling to them. We use them and throw them away. And in a consumer culture, it leads to hookup culture when it's applied to sex, where we use people as commodities and then we throw them away. We discard them. Can we imagine a better way as Christians? There's the better way of sexual intimacy with the person you love, with whom you vowed to honor and protect their dignity. Then there's the better way of abstaining from sex so that you can love a wide group of people with your heart and your mind. And when I think back on when I was your age, Sometimes it feels like you're kind of waiting around for the relationship bus to come and pick you up at the bus stop, right? It's a long wait sometimes, and the queue is long. It's frustrating. Sometimes you spend hours agonizing over your dating profile on whatever site you're using, or sleepless nights, or being incredibly, painfully self-conscious about how you look, how you're behaving. Here's my advice as I commend celibacy to you. Maybe stop worrying. I'll do this for a semester, maybe for a semester. Stop worrying about that relationship that always seems just out of reach. Be celibate. And take the hours you would spend on your dating profile, polishing it, and spend it instead on the people who are in reach right now. Like your nephew, your brother, your grandfather, your church community. This month, just for a month, think about being celibate. Stop agonizing about that one true love to come along. And seek instead intimacy with those many people that God has put in your life right now, the people who are right in front of you. Instead of praying every night that God will send you a girlfriend or a boyfriend, spend that time praying for the lonely people in your residence. Use your freedom that way. Maybe for a week, pledge to be celibate and stop procrastinating. Instead, take the risk of building intimate friendships with people of the opposite sex, with all their sorrows and with all their joys. Celibacy. I'm not saying do it forever. I'm just suggesting give it a try. For a week, a month, a semester, a season. Maybe it will lead you to flourish in the desert. Maybe Saint Kateri and her sort weren't so crazy after all. Here's a few questions to think about. You can break into some small groups. What's a good size? Groups of 6. 2 questions, talk about for 10 minutes or so. Do you know anyone who, like Saint Kateri, chose a life of celibacy? And why did they? And secondly, what aspects of a celibate life do you find unappealing? And what aspects appeal to you? So, have a good, honest discussion. And if you have any more questions, come and talk to me after. I'd be interested to hear your response to these questions too. Thanks.